Yeah, thank you, uh, Father Jose, for a kind introduction. I would also like to thank Dr. Thomas, the Department of English, and Dr. Robin for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. And St. Berkman's College has been a center for serious learning in Kerala. And it's a great opportunity to be part of its teaching projects. And I'm also very happy that a Department of English is organizing a series of lectures introducing philosophy. Because today, the most active centers of philosophical learning has been the literature department, sociology and history departments, in India and all around the world. So it is a great pleasure to be part of this series. And we thought today we would talk about critical philosophy. Now, I'm sure as students of literature, you are familiar with critical theory, right? And the word critical, right? So what do we mean by? Because we are familiar with the word criticism, right? We do literary criticism, art criticism, right? We do political and social criticism. So usually when we say, criticism, it is, a kind of basic meaning is that you find fault with something, right? So something is wrong. So criticism is a way of bringing out, displaying what is wrong, what is lacking in, something. And sometimes it is to point out errors in something. Sometimes it is to point out illusions. Sometimes it is to point out deception, right? This is what we do. And today we have one way in which we do criticism is we identify stereotypes, right? There are gender stereotypes, there are caste stereotypes. So we identify those stereotypes, and we say that when we use some concept, we say it is not actually a concept; it is actually some prejudice is sort of reified into this concept, right? We today use maybe a concept of Dalit or a Muslim, right? These are all stereotypes, and exposing these stereotypes is also criticism. Another one thing which we do when we criticize is we criticize authority, right? We criticize authority because that authority is illegitimate. This is one sense of, criticize. And when we criticize something, when we find fault with something, we always have some normative criterion which we invoke to say that, compared to the normative standard, what we are criticizing is lacking in something. And as we know, we can then criticize the norm itself. Right? So we use some norm or some standard to criticize something, and then we can criticize this norm itself. And this is what we generally call critical thinking. Right? So once you define critical thinking like this, then all thinking is critical thinking. One might say all philosophy is critical philosophy. I'm starting like this. We want to just know what is so specific about the critical philosophy of Kant or the 18th, 19th century European, or what we call Western philosophy. But let's start with the idea that one sense of criticism is that fault finding, and you expose errors, illusions, etc. You question the presupposition, normative standards. In that sense, all philosophy is, critical philosophy. But then we can also critique philosophy itself, right? Today it is very, very popular that, criticism of philosophy itself, right? For example, you've heard about Marx saying that philosophers have so far been only interpreting the world. It is time to change it, right? That's a criticism of philosophy. And philosophy uses these kinds of concepts like, truth, good, beauty. So you always ask who decides what is truth? Who decides what is beauty or good, right? So you can criticize this. So, often critical philosophy, the first target becomes philosophy itself. Or you might say, look, Socrates, a philosopher like Socrates, he talked about justice, morality, etc., but he didn't just notice the slaves all around him, right? The philosopher misses out oppression. He thinks that he is very critical of everything, but he sometimes just misses out the oppression which is just around him and which makes his own practice possible. That's why if you look at contemporary philosophy, almost everybody is a critique of philosophy itself, right? So end of philosophy, that is a major theme in modern philosophy. So one of the immediate task of critical philosophy is philosophy itself. As you know, in any discipline, the highest academic qualification is Doctor of Philosophy, right? So that's the kind of respect we pay for philosophy. But if you go to any philosophy discussions, everybody is saying that, look, philosophy is, it is nonsense. It is something which is already embroiled in a lot of structures of deception and oppression, etc. So let's notice this peculiar point, right? And suppose if we conduct a poll, right? Who are your favorite critical philosophers? My guess is that it will be Marx and Michel Foucault. And all of you are familiar with these two names. And Marx, we said Marx actually used critique against philosophy, right? Where he said the philosophers have only been interpreting the world. Now, if you take somebody like Foucault, Foucault has a very famous essay called lecture called What is Critique? Now, in that essay, Foucault says, I am not a philosopher and barely a critique. Right? I am not a philosopher and I am barely a critique. In fact, he is denying that he is a philosopher. He is denying that he is a critique. And why do you think one of our, we all think that he is one of the most critical modern philosophers, but he says, I am not a philosopher or a critique. Right? So here, critical philosophy now, you can use critique to criticize philosophy itself, and some people actually uses critical philosophy to critique itself. Right? So this is the general context. That is, you can actually, all philosophy is in some sense critical thinking, and it criticizes philosophy itself, and it criticizes critique itself. Now, what is philosophy beyond critique? Suppose if you criticize criticism itself, what is beyond that? And we will come to that. People call it speculative philosophy. If there is philosophy beyond critical thinking, it is often called speculative thinking. And if you are a critique, but you are criticizing philosophy, that is critique beyond philosophy, is what we call critical theory. Now, I was just giving that introduction because as students of literature, you might be interested in critical theory. So critical theory is not applying some critical philosophy to literary text or social phenomena. So, in fact, critical theory is a radicalization of critical philosophy where criticism target philosophy itself. And it says, look, we can't, critique cannot now proceed as philosophy. So, this is one aspect of critique. We started with the idea of critique as criticizing faults, errors, etc. Now, let us also think about this idea about our, the word critical from our familiar context. Where do we use the word critical? We often use it in a therapeutic context, right? A medical patient is in a critical situation. So what do we mean by critical there? A patient is critical when, you have tried all available ways of curing him, and then you realize that any attempt to cure him could also damage him, right? So we don't know, we don't have any guarantee. We can just try out things, but anything which you do to save him could, with equal probability, damage him, right? The knowledge of the doctor is not going to help, but his experience might help. So he has to make a very decisive intervention into the critical situation if he really wants to save a patient. So in fact, this is one sense of the word critical, which, if you actually look at its etymology, the word critical actually shares etymological root with the word crisis, right? That is the idea we get in the medical context. The word is crinane, right? Krinein, crinane. It actually means a situation of crisis as a kind of turning point, right? Where you need to separate something to making a decisive cut. That's the way of critique. Critique as a decisive response to a situation of crisis. Now, this is also in the history of philosophy a very familiar notion. For example, if you take a philosopher like Socrates, right, the the great expert of critical thinking. In fact, one of his disciples compare Socrates to a torpedo fish, right? A poisonous fish. He really stings you. That is what he does as a teacher, right? And if you look at Socrates' dialogues, right, they start discussing various things. And what Socrates does is Socrates just proves that everybody else's notion about anything is actually wrong. Right? And then he is not going to claim that he knows it. He says, no. He says, I also don't know anything. And then he will argue that I don't have the qualifications for being a teacher to teach you, right? I'm not qualified to teach my half knowledge to you, right? So in that sense, he creates a kind of total intellectual paralysis in his, students. And then everybody begin to love Socrates because there is a kind of truthfulness in Socrates' voice. As one of his disciples says, Socrates' voice is like a Dorian, harmony. So everybody decide to study under Socrates. As you know, the Delphi oracle said Socrates knows everything. Whereas when people asked Socrates, Socrates said, I know nothing. Right? So Socrates' life is a kind of crisis between two things. That is, on the one hand, the God's pronouncement that he knows everything, and the other with his own self-realization that he knows nothing. So he created that kind of a situation of crisis in the classroom, in the place where he's meeting his students, which actually calls for critical, thinking. As I think students of literature, you might have read Paul Demand's famous essay called Criticism and Crisis, right? So here, the idea, so we have seen one idea of criticism as fault finding errors, finding illusions, etc. Another way of a sense of the word critical is responding to a situation of crisis. Now, there could be a third meaning. So what we are trying to do is, from our everyday experience, from our language, just to get a sense of what we mean by the critical before we go into a thinker. And I'm sure those of you who have studied physics might have heard this word critical mass, right? Critical mass is when a nuclear fissile material, the minimum mass you need so that a chain reaction can start, right? So if it is below the minimum, nothing will happen. But if it crosses a certain threshold, the nuclear chain reaction will start, it will really explode. Right? So critical also means a point of a threshold of explosion of novelty. Right? So we have three senses of the critical. One is critique as fault finding. The second is critique as a response to a critical situation, crisis. And the third is critique as a threshold of novelty, of explosion, of creativity, etc. Right? So with this kind of picture in mind, let us find out, what is it that what we call European Enlightenment or modern philosophy, where we often associate this critical philosophy thinking with Immanuel Kant, the German, philosopher of 18th century, and what is specific to his notion of critique. Actually, we are all actually responding to the legacy of that idea about critique. So I would like to suggest that the specific sense of critique in Kant is we need three terms in order to understand. One is this idea of critique. As you know, Kant wrote three major critiques, like critique of pure reason, critique of practical reason, and critique of judgment. Right? And critique of pure reason is about a critique of knowledge, our faculty of knowledge. And critique of practical reason is a critique of morality. And the critique of judgment is a critique of our judgments of beauty in art or in purposiveness in nature, etc. So his idea about a critique, actually other two terms we should place along with critique is the idea of enlightenment and modernity. Right? So what we find in Kant is this three aspects of philosophical thinking. One is critique, the second is enlightenment, and third is modernity. Right? So, see, that's what we often ask, whether say, Indian tradition, Indian philosophy, is it not critical philosophy? In some sense, it is, yes, like everybody criticizes, everybody invokes standards, right? But what we call the critical philosophy is actually something which combines these three elements, like critique, some critical attitude, which is there from Socrates onwards, but it is evoked in a certain specific historical context of enlightenment and modernity. Now, if you look at the word enlightenment, right, and the specific sense in which it is used in connection with Kant and European modernity, like it is actually a call for freedom. Right? And in fact, Kant, says this call of enlightenment is for a freedom from self-incurred immaturity. Right? That's what Kant is trying. Kant wants to wake up human thinking from immaturity. What kind of immaturity? It is a self-incurred. We have brought it upon ourselves, this immaturity. So critical philosophy in Kant is a philosophy which is calls upon reason to free, our thinking to free from this immaturity which we brought it upon ourselves. Now, what is immaturity? Immaturity means that, usually when we say immature is, one way to it's kind of reckless, right? So we have a courage to know, right? In Europe, the sciences, there is a great excitement about scientific knowledge, right? So we have a certain drive, a certain courage to know. But this courage actually shouldn't become reckless. So how do you retain this reason's great trust to knowledge within a certain limit? And that limit cannot be imposed from outside, right? So it has to be something which our own reason, decides or limit, right? So within that, how can we conduct ourselves as mature, rational thinkers? So this is the idea. So in here, Kant is really not talking about escaping from illusions, deceptions, errors, faults, etc. Right? It is an attempt to free from immaturity. And how do you do the free from immaturity? That is, one way is that reason will now undertake public and courageous use of reason. So this is the time we something called a division between public and private use of reason, the idea of public sphere, etc. come up, right? And what do you mean by public sphere is that, look, if I am a university teacher, to my classroom I can go and I can criticize everyone. But my private thing means I have a contract with my institution that I will teach from, say, 8 to 9:30, right? And that I cannot question. I'll have to go and do it. But that gives me a freedom in order to, use of publicly courageous use of my, reason. And the other side of it is what King Frederick, said, the Kant's most favorite monarch, that argue as much as you want to, so far as you obey. Right? That actually creates a context of this. So enlightenment actually means some kind of a voluntary insubordination, right? You question everything, you demand freedom, and that is based on the maturity and courage of reason. Now, what do we mean by modernity? Now, modernity also means that often we understand this term, pitching it against something like tradition, right? And modernity means an acute sense of the present, right? That is, everything has to be subjected to the criticism of the present, right? So earlier modernity actually understand itself by comparing itself with the past, right? So, India also have tradition. Say, for example, you have something called Nyaya philosophy. Then you have something called Navya Nyaya, where it might be, comparing itself with the tradition. But modernity doesn't define with respect to tradition. Modernity resides with an acute sense of its present, right? What are the challenges of reason facing in the present, right? So that the idea is that the reason can now constitute a tribunal where all claims has to be interrogated and judged, right? So this is what the idea about modernity. So what happens in Kant is a bringing together of critical thinking along with this sense of enlightenment and the question of modernity. This is a unique combination which happens in Kant. And the idea is that, as I said, the idea is that Kant is actually, the whole philosophical thinking is now, it's a kind of courtroom, right? You have a tribunal which reason is going to institute, in which all our other faculties, our ability to know, our moral thinking, our aesthetic thinking, all can be brought there. They will be allowed to make their claim, and we will see what are the limits within which they can conduct, and within which reason itself will be interrogated. That's a kind of tribunal that philosophy is going to set up. So critical thinking, the kind of metaphor you can think about it is a kind of tribunal, and the philosopher as a kind of legislature, right? A self-legislature. Now, this is a great dream of philosophy, because in Plato, you will find philosopher as a king, right? And whereas in the case of Kant, what inaugurates European modernity is the idea about a philosopher, a tribunal, or kind of a judicial, setup. Now, how does this question about enlightenment and the question about knowledge comes up for Kant? For example, one of these, Kant actually poses three very important questions. One is, what can I know? Right. The second is, what should I do? Right. What can I know is a question about, say, science, scientific knowledge, etc. The second is, what should I do? That's a question about morality. And the third is, what can I hope for? Right. So these are the three important questions each of these critiques are trying to address. Now let us take this question, what can I know? Now, knowledge is an important area of investigation for philosophers, and we call it epistemology, the branch of philosophy which studies knowledge. Right. So what is knowledge is an important question for philosophers. The Platonic definition of knowledge, or the accepted notion that knowledge is justified through belief, etc. Right? Now, philosophers often thought that they can actually explicate the meaning of, they can tell you what knowledge is, right? What is the basis of knowledge? And our knowledge thinking had to be guided by those principles which philosophy can discover. Right? So you will find people like Descartes trying to give a method for science, right? So today we philosophers don't dabble in science, but there was a time all great philosophers were also scientists and mathematicians. They got into science and mathematics, into optics, into probability theory, into geometry, into number theory, and then they do a piece of work, and then also they set up some schema of how to produce, go ahead with knowledge. Maybe, today all, as I said, PhD itself is kind of a legacy from that side. But something which Kant realizes with the advent of Newtonian physics is that science doesn't need this guidance from the philosophers, right? Science on its own has gone ahead in making a big revolution in knowing nature, right? So for the first time, philosophy is almost encountering knowledge as if it is coming from, outside, right? And science is a peculiar kind of vocation. In science, that almost everything which is accepted as today might turn out to be false tomorrow. But still, it is an exciting activity to know in order to indulge in, right? So it is a context in which Kant is asking the question, what can I know, right? So what is the confidence with which the reason can get into this practice of knowledge, and what are the norms, discipline, the sense of limit reason should have in order to get into this cognitive activity. Now you take the question about morality and politics. What Kant is facing is French Revolution. And French Revolution is not something which Kant really liked anything about it, right? And many of his favorite moral beliefs were shattered by, people, normal people, working class people are going out into the public, they are questioning, they are beheading the emperor, there is blood, there is ruckus, there is indisciplined behavior. But Kant realizes that something definite about human progress, moral progress, is disclosed in French Revolution, right? So people are violating all other notions of good, morality, etc., which philosophers could give. The people have taken an initiative in creating a moral world, right? So it is here that the philosopher now has to ask the question, what should I do? How do I think about, morality? Now, philosopher cannot come up and give you a theory of the good. I think the same thing happens in art too. You know what is modern art. You define art, and there was a time from philosophy thought about this discipline called aesthetics, which define what art is. Now in art, you try to define art, somebody will immediately come up and produce a work of art which really violates it, right? The limit of something like Duchamp taking a toilet commode and taking it to be a work of art, right? That is the question that we need to ask. What is the basis of our judgment in matters of aesthetic? So in this new configuration, Kant is asking the question about knowledge, and then the question, his project is to say that, okay, if scientific activity, knowledge activity is an activity of reason, then what are the limits within which this activity can, conduct? What are the limits to knowledge? What are the conditions for possibility of knowledge, right? There are things which, earlier people tried to know about. People tried to know about nature as such. People tried to know about my soul. People tried to know about God. And everybody tried to prove the existence of God as if, God is like electron or positron or something like that. So Kant is trying to say that no, we can actually draw the rational limits of reason, and we can say that, look, there are certain things which you cannot know, right? And the reason shouldn't force knowledge in order to enter those areas. And Kant says that it is the kind of two philosophical streams which he faced. We inherited rationalism and empiricism, right? And I'm sure you must be familiar with this. Rationalist believes that the basis of knowledge are some innate ideas which we have untainted by any sensory experience, and empiricists claim that actually the only ground for knowledge is experience. And Hume, one of the thinkers which actually the most critical influence on Kant, right? Kant says that Hume actually forced him, woke him up from the dogmatic slumber, right? And Hume said something which is very, very simple today. How do we gain knowledge, right? We actually notice sun is rising in the east every day. So 10 days I observe it and I say that, look, sun rises in the east. The Hume said, no, all that you can say is that 10 days we have observed a pattern. You have no reason to make any universal claim about this, right? So you cannot actually, you cannot have earlier notions of knowledge if you are actually basing your knowledge based on experience. Now, Kant actually makes idea that, look, all this confusion about questions of knowledge is that you think that knowledge is a passive activity. Knowing is a passive activity. You have reality out there, and I have this clean mind, the kind of mirror, and I am just trying to passively pick up things about the world. He said, look, that's not the way knowledge works. Knowledge works in the sense of knowledge is actually the first move in knowledge is made by the knowing subject. We make the first move towards, reality, right? So we have concepts, right? The basic inventory of Kant is we have concepts and then we have sensations. And Kant says, concepts without sensations are empty and sensations without concepts are blind. So you need both of them together in order to have knowledge. But this is possible only if we make the first move into right? This is the beginning of this idea that knowledge is, constructed by the knowing subject. We take the initiative with respect to, right? That is where imagination plays a big role in Kant's idea about knowledge. So we don't have time to go into the details of it, but I just want to give you a sense of how does critical philosophy pose the question about knowledge, right? So what do you mean by, we make the first move in knowledge? For example, I have an object, in front. I have a tea cup, my coffee cup in front of me. But when I look at it, I can actually, my sensory experience is only on one or two sides of the cup. But I actually see the whole cup, right? And the cup has an inside which I cannot see. So I'm not making a guesswork that, it has an inside. I actually see it as a cup with all the sides with an inside in it, right? So it's not I see it, right? And it's not that I do a guesswork, but I have an immediate ability in order to have a meaningful experience of a cup as something which I can pick up, I can bring it close, I can drink coffee in it, etc. Right? So if I actually touch my table in front of me, I can see my table, I can touch my table. If I knock, there is a sound. Now, these are not the sound, the sight, and the touch. These are not three different things which are floating together like that, which I need to bring it together to become a table. It comes to me as the sound of the table, the appearance of the visual appearance of the table, the tactile experience of the table. So the object is tied together, right, in order to appear in front of the unity of my consciousness, right? So the experience, basically we are saying that experience has a structure, right? It is tied together. It has a certain unity to the object. That is the way the experience come together, right? So this synthesizing, this unification, this putting this into this structure is something which I do as a cognitive engine. And that's why, for example, if a scientist, when he does an experiment, he knows for sure that angels are not going to land up in his lab. How does he know? It has nothing to do with his belief in angels exist or not, right? Because through the scientific experiments, he actually creates a structure through which only certain objects are possible, right? And in fact, another, later philosopher, Sellas, has this beautiful word for it, called it, myth of the given. Usually philosophy think that, reality is given to us in some straight, immediate manner. But Kant said, no, actually, reality is given to us in experience which has a certain structure. In other words, another way to say that my senses are not merely just picking up sensations from there. They speak to us, right? My eyes tell me, oh, here is a laptop in front of me, right? That's what my eyes actually tells me, so that I can say, yes, yes, there is a laptop, right? So my senses actually speak to me, right? So that is the structure of my senses. And I will also just quickly introduce you, maybe we could have avoided it, but another technical term which Kant uses, which I'm sure when you read, it might be useful for you. So this one way to understand this initiative with the cognitive subject does, that he used a technical term, synthetic a priori. Right? Now, it's maybe important thing to know about it. In order to, you are familiar with the word synthetic, you should understand it against the term analytic. I say something is analytic when I say that the predicate is contained in the subject. For example, if I say all bodies are extended, it is an analytic because the word extended is part of my idea about my body. The moment I say body, I don't have to ask, oh, does it have any length or breadth of anything? No, it is actually no. Another typical example is you say bachelors are unmarried men, right? I don't have to go and do any experiment. I know it's contained in the word. And these kinds of things are a priori, that's a prior to experiment. Whereas a statement like, water boils at 100 degrees centigrade, boiling at 100 degrees centigrade is not contained in the idea about water. We need to check, experiment, and find out. This is called a posteriori. So usually analytic, we connect with a priori, prior to experience, and synthetic, we connect it to that which comes through after experience. But Kant makes this unique discovery that there are synthetic a prioris. That is, something about the world we can sort of put to work, right? We can receive the world through a network, through a structure, which is not matter of experience at all, right? We will, as rational agent, we will set it up so that the nature reality will, speak to us. Now, anything which is beyond this domain of this possible experience is not matter of knowledge at all. So something which is speak to us through this structure of experience is called phenomena. And that which is beyond this possible experience is called noumena, or a thing in itself. Right? Now, reason will be committing a big mistake if it drives our knowledge faculty to go and knowledge about reality in itself. That we can't know, right? Knowledge means listening to what your senses, what your experience is telling you. Anything beyond that, that silent reality is not something which is you can really come to know, right? And this is what we call the Copernican revolution in philosophy. That is now if you really want to ask the question, what can I know? We need to shift the center of this knowledge business to the knowing subject, right? And then we can say that there is something is beyond knowledge and we shouldn't get into that at all, right? And this is actually the idea about Kant is trying to formulate the knowing subject as a very, very finite. We have limited abilities, right? And we have to, maturity means to understand our limitation. And what is our limitation? We cannot know any reality independent of our relationship with that reality, right? So that reality which is beyond our relationship with the reality is the noumena, the thing itself about which we reason. So now the task of critical thinking is guarding the reason from, forcing our cognitive faculty to go and know reality in itself, right? When you travel in metro, you get this thing that mind the gap, right, between the train and the platform. So Kantian critical thinking is all that they mind the gap between noumena and phenomena, right? This is what critical thinking should go. Now, quickly to do what he does in the domain of morality is, in practical reason. Let's look at the notion about when you come to morality. See, in knowledge, what happens is, see, I didn't tell you about Kant has this idea that the knowing subject, we have certain faculties, right? So one faculty is the faculty of knowledge. The other is the faculty of desire, which works, actually in moral thinking. Then we have the faculty of judgment. Now, when I use my faculty of knowledge, right, my reason actually is allowing delegate the power to my cognitive faculty to work, right? And it will not force knowledge faculty to go step beyond its limit. Now, when it comes to morality, reason itself is in charge. Now, what is just morality for Kant? Morality for Kant is, it's not something to do with our moral feeling. Let me give you, to make it very fast. For example, take a morality is a matter of moral, law, right? You have a law, thou shalt not kill, right? Don't kill. Now, why is it how does you understand it as moral? It is not because it is there in the 10 commandments, right? It's not because it is given to us by God. It's not there because it is in IPC. If I commit some murder, the police will catch me. That's not the reason. It's not because if I kill somebody, my victim or his relatives all will be will go through pain and misery and sadness. That's not the reason. Also not because, killing somebody is a big mess. There is a lot of blood and flesh will splash around. That's not the reason either, right? It is because there is a commandment. There is a certain formal structure of the law. It imposes itself on me, right? And I am a person who can actually put myself into unconditional laws. That law doesn't serve any interest, right? It doesn't attend to any of my emotions. It doesn't attend to any of my, if I kill somebody, if I am caught by the police, I will be punished. No. Even if I live in a country where killing is actually a sweet experience, even if it is moral, legally permitted, still something in me, don't kill, right? It's something which I experience in my classroom. People think that if the invigilator is not there, students are going to copy exams. But you try to just leave the exam hall with a question paper. Whole lot of students will say, no, it's just wrong. It's because we can conduct ourselves under moral laws, which we are applicable to everyone. They are universal laws, right? Which we give it to ourselves, right? And when I give the law to myself, then I can be free. Now, critique of morality discovers this condition by which I can give myself orders, right? And if this order, this law has a universal structure, and if it is free from interest, then this law itself is the site of my freedom. And now the reason actually can mistake this, this freedom, because we have to act in a way which is governed by the natural laws and natural necessities, right? And we shouldn't confuse our morality with where we can actually initiate actions, right? What I must do, right? Our ability to initiate action shouldn't be confused with the moral laws of the natural world. Also, that moral law cannot, somebody who is moral, there is no guarantee that he will have a happy life. There's no necessary link between, even though we hope for his, we want to construct a world where moral people will have a joyful, meaningful life, but there is no guarantee to that. Now, the critique actually enables you to work like this. And when you come to the matters of aesthetic, that you take our judgment about a work of art. I go and watch a movie and I like the movie, right? So I tell somebody that, look, it's a great film. Now my friend says, look, oh no, it's a really bad film. So what do I do, right? So my judgment that it is a good film, I like the film, it is not merely an expression that, it was nice watching it, right? For example, having a cup of hot coffee, now I like it. And if you don't like it, I don't argue with you. But if you don't like a movie which I loved or lost, I am going to argue with you. I'm going to say, why don't you look at the direction? Why don't you look at the acting, right? There is something for me to. So when I say I like a film, I am doing it for everyone. I am expecting that everyone will like it, even though I don't have any Newton's law in order to tell you how to do this, right? And at the same time, when I say I like a film, it is not because it is agreeable to my senses or my interest, etc. No, right? And I say that a movie will have a certain unity, it has a certain purposiveness, but it doesn't actually fill in any actual purpose of mind. So you have in the aesthetic judgment, you have a judgment where you make a universal claim, but without conceptual knowledge. You see a sense of purposiveness and authorial creation without really having any purpose built into it. Right? And you take an interest in it, you like the work, even though it doesn't serve any interest of yours. Right? So this is the nature of the judgment which we do. We have the ability to take pleasure in the exercise of judgment, like this. So what Kant is now trying to do is the critical thinking is actually trying to find out the limits of reason when it is trying to know the world, when it is trying to act morally. What are the limits of how do you conduct oneself within that, limit, right? And this is the task of critical philosophy in Kant. Now, I said the Kant asks, critical philosophy asks these three questions: what can I know, what should I do, and what I may hope for. But there is one question which we didn't say, and that is where the entire critique of critical philosophy will be launched at, right? So we said this is both the knowledge, our morality itself, etc., are actually should be understood as the work of a subject, right? The subject's spontaneity, its initiative. That's what Kant is trying to make a room for critical thinking, right? Even though we have moral law, in morality, we actually follow moral law. In science, we actually have, a causally linked word which has certain uniformities, etc., right? But still, these are all works of a subject, right? Now, what is the subject? Now, Kant actually asked the final question: what is man, right? This subject, which Kant says, who actually structures our experience in such a way, is a peculiar entity called man. And what is man? It's not just Homo sapiens, right? This man is somebody who actually sees all his possibilities in terms of his limitations, right? He is somebody who uses his limits as his springing point, right? So in the case of knowledge, what he realizes is that the condition of possibility of his experience is the same as the condition of possibility of the objects of experience, right? So it is under these conditions that he can know, but then he cannot know reality in itself, right? So, and it is this limitation that allows him to launch modern science as a project, right? The same way in morality, he has no idea what good is, right? But you don't need, in a classroom, all my students come with different conceptions about what good is. But we can think about a moral conduct, a free moral conduct, even though we don't know what ultimate good is. We don't know whether our conceptions of good will ultimately produce happiness or not, right? So man is a peculiar entity who actually think about his freedom and his potential based on his limitation, as somebody who is focused on his limitation. Like later a philosopher like Heidegger will say, we are a kind of entity our life is a possibility, but there is one possibility that I cannot transfer, my ownmost possibility, and that is my death, right? So man is this peculiar entity who actually individuates himself, right? His unique possibility is his own death, right? His own limitation. So, hence this Kantian subject, the subject of critical, thinking, right? In some sense, it is the later philosophers will say this is a peculiar anthropocentrism that is work, right? The Kantian critique couldn't penetrate its own anthropocentric. It actually develops an extremely subtle, complicated machinery in order to make reason comprehend its own limit, but it is actually the limits of a peculiar entity, right, called man. Now, should thinking be tied to a human being, right? So it is the question today artificial intelligence is actually asking is, can thinking ever release itself from this, right? And these are the questions that people like Hegel will ask later, right? Hegel will accuse Kant of, that mind the gap, right? He's saying that, look, there is something called reality in itself, which you cannot really know, but that reality in itself is actually posited by the power of your own reason, right? So in that sense, right, the reason, if it can reflectively come to know about its potential, it has actually come to know about what reality in itself. Why didn't Kant make that jump, right? So this is where somebody like Hegel will propose something like absolute knowledge. This idea of limits, knowledge within limitation, was actually a certain hesitation in Kant. But philosophy should go ahead and say it can know absolute, because that absolute is nothing. We think that absolute is something which is the final thing. No. What we know absolute knowledge is the idea that the final thing is nothing but my striving towards that finality. That is what ultimately we are driving towards, right? So there is science's ultimate knowledge is not something which come towards the end, but something which the subject has, a scientist has, while immersing into the scientific activity, is the absolute knowledge, right? So Hegel will later expand this idea about this transcendental formal subject of Kant into something which is a socio-historically rooted concept, which actually knows itself within history, etc. And just as a in the parenthesis, I want to say that some of the Indian, for example, today, if I say absolute knowledge, etc., everybody will laugh at you, right? No, these are all illusions about knowledge. But Hegel was making a claim that we can actually know. Critical philosophy should critique the fear of falling into this error, right? Imagine somebody who doesn't get out of the metro because he's all the time minding the gap. You have to make that jump, right? He says critical thinking should make you to jump like that, right? And some of the Indian philosophers like K.C. Bhattacharya, Hirandar Haldar, who were actually great defenders of, the Hegel was saying that in India we are quite comfortable with this absolute knowledge. So why are you hesitating, etc. Now, before just concluding, I just want to take maybe just 5 minutes to tell what happened to this critical philosophy. I told you about the Hegelian criticism of the Kantian hesitations of critique. That critique is sort of inhibited a lot. It should allow its potential to go ahead, right? And Marx, who came later, actually saw this point, but he says, okay, we need to go beyond, as it is in Kant, but for Hegel, it is still happening within a certain conception of philosophy, within a certain conception about ideas. Like history is something which is driven by ideas, but we need to really look at the material conditions which makes this cognitive moral subject possible, right? So that is where he says that you have to get out of the philosophy critique itself. Now, a strand which comes out of this criticism is what we will later find as critical theory in the Frankfurt School. They will argue that critique today has to leave its philosophical moorings, and it has to become a critical theory of society, right? The social conditions for the production of this cognitive moral subject, etc. And then they realize that actually what Kant saw as a moment of great confidence is actually a moment where there was a split in Western reason between a technical reason. What happens in the reason when it got excited into science, it began to think that the entire operation of reason is nothing but technical reason, technological reason, how to optimize means in order to get some ends. It actually changed the nature of scientific knowledge itself into a kind of technological nature, right? In that process, then reason's entire potentiality actually got usurped by this technological view on nature. And in this attempt to use reason to control external nature actually led to the reification of our internal nature itself. So in that sense, what we call enlightenment itself has become a big myth from which we need to free, right? So philosophy, critical philosophy has to free from a certain idea about critique, a certain idea about enlightenment, certain idea about modernity. That is what proceeds as the critical theory about society. Now, another strand is what we find in people like Nietzsche and today people like Foucault, etc. They asked another question. They said, look, why do when critical philosophy identify the limits, right? The idea is not to stay within the limit, but in order to transgress the limits. That should be the task of critical thinking. Now, as you know that every limit, right? If you tell somebody don't cross this limit, people have a tendency to cross that limit. That is where actually you are merely falling into the trap of that limit, right? Now, the idea is not to stay within what the limit says, also not where break the limit, where the limit is inviting you to break. But the task of thinking, critical thinking, is to establish a more free relationship with the limit, right? This is what they call the transgression of the limit, right? You establish a certain, you actually free from the normative power of the no, normative power of the limit, right? So from Nietzsche asked a question about knowledge. He says, okay, we have a will to knowledge. Human being has this almost a species level drivenness towards truth and knowledge, right? Now, this knowledge, what philosophy is all the time trying to do is how do I discipline this will to knowledge, right? By clubbing it to knowledge as something which is justified true belief, right? Nietzsche said, no. This our instinct to know it has a much more power, right? It should be free from this disciplinary aspect of justification, the subjective aspect of belief, right, etc., and the teleological aspect of truth, etc., and it should be made into a more creative practice. That is what critique should do, right? People like Foucault later will call it as a aesthetic of existence. That is, that drive for knowledge can be made into to give better forms than what the scientific knowledge is trying to give. And here we are actually looking at the third dimension of knowledge as critical mass, where critique is the explosion of novelty, right? So we started with the idea about critique as the fault finding, and then critique as a response to a crisis, and critique as something which is, explosiveness of novelty. And when we find the Nietzschean tradition, we find critical thinking demanding this, this kind of critique itself. Critical thinking becomes a very creative thinking. So thank you. I think I will conclude it here.
Thank you, sir, for the enlightening lecture. Now we'll begin the Q&A session. Sir Agnes and I would be reading out the questions from the chat box.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, Agnes.
Okay. Sir, the first question is from Anuja Jose. Sir, Kant considered mathematics as synthetic knowledge a priori, but shouldn't it be analytic? I have never understood his explanation as to why he considers this discipline as synthetic.
Yeah, that is actually a very important and very challenging part of the Kantian schema, that mathematical knowledge, right? Usually we think that everything in mathematics is logically derivable from first principle, like there's a logical basis to mathematics. Whereas something like physics is a matter of experience, right? That's what we say physics is something which is synthetic, and normally we would say something which is mathematics entirely seen as logically should have been analytic. But Kant says that's what, for Kant, he understands mathematics as a world directed, right? The question is, why do we think that, all natural sciences have a mathematics fits well with physics, right? So if mathematics is entirely analytical, how does it, it just so happens, right? There's a very famous paper called The Unnatural Effectivity of Mathematics in Nature. Why do mathematics become such a efficient framework for speaking about the synthetic world? So according to Kant, then, something like geometry, right, is possible only if we have a priori, synthetic a priori of space, right? Space as something which is, we have a grasp on it, which is prior to our experience with the world. But it is this experience, this prior is not in my mind, right? It is in my opening to the world. It's with respect to this world that this prior structure is there. Okay? This is his idea about the synthetic a priori, and the idea about, so then he actually interprets the Euclidean geometry in terms of as something which is about the world, right? And that is where the synthetic nature, like the numbers are about the bodies which is counted. So it is pertinent. It is pertinent to the world, right? But it's a priori in the sense it is not subject to 2 plus 3 is equal to 5. You don't have to check by stones and everything, etc. But it is world bound, right? Now, in that sense, one might say people have talked about analytical a posteriorize, right? So, something like a Goldbach conjecture, where I say that every even integer about 2 can be given as a sum of prime numbers, right? It should have been analytical, but it is actually a posterior. You don't have a proof for doing it. So, but this reading of Kant of mathematics being a synthetic discipline has been thoroughly questioned by later mathematicians, right? And they actually see it in a kind of psychologism in Kant, right? So you will find in people like Frege, etc., there is something called a return to logicism, right? To get back the logical foundations of mathematics. And then we have in people like Husserl, people again going back to say, okay, you have to understand geometry in the measurement practices in the life world, not in some logical operations in anybody's head or some semantic properties of the language in which these symbols are coined. So I hope I could throw some light on that very, very important question. I think one way to get an entry into Kant is to pursue that question which the questioner has asked. In what sense is mathematics is a worldly discipline?
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Shraddha Singh. Is Kant's idea of the beautiful based on synthetic a priori judgment?
The synthetic a priori is in the domain where we actually question of knowledge, right? So Kant make a distinction between two kinds of knowledge. One is determinate judgment and the other is reflective judgment. So in my view, the question of synthetic a priori is pertinent only when we know the world, right? Where we determine the world. That is what a determinate judgment is, right? Something like, when Newton asked the question, why did the apple fall? Right? He is actually converting that apple, the planets also fall, my cup also will fall, right? Every object which I am studying can be reduced to something like a point mass, an instance of my Newtonian knowledge, right? That's what determinate judgment. The question about synthetic a priori comes in there. But when it comes to the beautiful, it's actually a reflective judgment. I am not actually, when I say something is beautiful, in some sense, I am not applying a concept to that object, right? I am actually talking about my feelings. But my feelings are not my empirical feelings. It is something which is shareable, which is free from interest, etc. And in the case of reflective judgment, In the case of determinate judgment, I actually move from Newton's law to every object I explain, right? Every object will be made an instance which is describable by Newton's law. But when I actually do aesthetic judgment, I don't have a Newton's law there, right? My attention is actually on that work of art or the beautiful object, right? But then I try to look for a universal structure in which I can include in it, right? Without any guarantee for doing it, right? So it's like, a judge. A judge, when he tried to pass a judgment, so he has to apply a law onto a specific case, right? But he can't apply the law the way Newton's law is applied on the mass, right? Because each crime is something very specific itself. So the judge has to attend to the specificity of the case in order to find out under which law I should bring in order to judge. So what he does is he goes by looking at precedents, like prior cases where somebody applied this case. I think it is the situation in the aesthetic judgment is of similar kind.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Satyaranjan Senapati. What is Critique of Empiricism by Quine and Strawson?
But Quine and Strawson?
Yes, sir. The spelling is Quine.
Yeah, I think we will talk about it, but it's not pertinent to our talk here, right? And in some sense, but still, since he asked the question, in some sense, Strawson is a Kantian, right? He wrote that great classic, The Bound of Sense, where the Strawson, in many senses, buys this idea that what Kant is doing is criticizing the myth of the given. But for Strawson, right, these a priori structures are actually embedded in language, right? He is a philosopher of the linguistic term, right? In fact, the way to understand our knowledge is looking at the proposition which we say about the world, right? So that is the framework within which both Quine and Strawson will address the question. Like, language is their area where they look at the structure of our experience. Now, in the case of Quine, this criticism takes a more turn towards pragmaticism, right? When he says that to be is the to be of a variable, right? It actually makes a pragmatic turn, right? In that sense, that is why he actually questioned the very distinction between, he has this famous essay called the Two Dogmas of Empiricism, where he says the distinction between analytic and synthetic, right? It itself is a untenable distinction. And Strawson has a very famous criticism of his own reading, right? In my view, it's an interminable debate because they are both saying, I didn't understand the, both of them says that the other person didn't understand each other, right? So for Strawson, for Quine, the empiricism's basic, empiricism itself is based on the idea that there is some sense in which, say, my claims about the world can be pitched against the world. So there are some statements which comes with the idea that my statement can be pitched about the world, and there are some statements which I know, like when I say bachelors are unmarried men, I don't have to go and test. But there are other statements like water boils at 100, I know I have to go and test it, right? And Quine is making a case, and no, there is no way in which this is like this. That distinction, and we don't even need that distinction, because science is not like pitching the entire each sentence of it against the world, and right. So the science, our knowledge and the world impinges at some selected locations, right? which will be pragmatically decided. And if the vulnerability is exposed, it will collapse. Otherwise, it won't. Right? So the empiricism is too anxious a philosophy, thinking that everything has to be built from there.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Abida Faruqi. Was Kant a theist or an atheist?
Oh, Kant was theist, right? And his idea, the entire enterprise was to make room for faith. That was, in fact, the other side of critical thinking in Kant was to make room for faith and see whether we can practice religion within the limits of reason. That was the question which he asked, right? So, for example, the idea about God, right, is a rational idea available to us, right? And the reason, as it is reason's own idea, right? It's reason's strength that we have the idea about God. But the problem happens when we mess it up with the cognitive faculty, right? Or we invoke him as an authority in our moral discourse, right? Or, for example, if you look at teleological, when you look living creature, right? You definitely want to think about that living creature has a certain purpose to it, right? And so, where is the origin of the purpose? Then we generally think about a creator, somebody who created this. When you really look at the uniform way, in meaningful way in which, right? Now, this demand, right? This demand is a demand on my reflective reason. It is when I reflect on myself, right? This idea is an invigorating idea for me to think that there is a God. But if I ever try to bring that God into my science, then it will go haywire. So I should know it, right? It's not so I should be able to gain this great vitality, the idea about a creator God brings in my reflective judgment without ever making into a actual creator of God. So that way he's a theist and he's trying to make room for God after Newtonian physics. Now we can't say that there is something in the world which is beyond scientific world, which is beyond our cognition, etc. No, whatever is in the domain of a possible object of knowledge will be known in the right. But then there are things which don't enter into that domain, right? An idea of God is something which is good for, according to Kant, one might say that it's good for a scientist to have an idea about God, right? But he shouldn't think that, okay, that is, he's doing something. It shouldn't come and play around with his causal chain. He cannot invoke God in his causal account about why things are, happening.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Girish C. Can you elaborate on your initial comment on the stereotypical nature of Dalit Muslim as categorized and refined notions of the present?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It was rather incidental remark I made about what critical reason. Today, the way critical reason work is by exposing ideological illusions. Right? We take something to be normal there, right, without ever knowing that it is something which is constructed by us. Right? That is ideology. Right? The famous Marx statement that religion is the soul of the soulless world. Right? It is only in a cruel world that all the human qualities we projected something outside and ascribe it to God. Right? So that is the Marxist criticism about the religious ideology. Now today, the one concept which the critique of ideology uses is the idea about stereotype. Right? Now, let us take a stereotype. We are doing it, in a very intellectual context. For example, stereotypes about minorities, stereotype against women, right? For example, if you take the stereotype that certain minority community is anti-national, right? Now, criticism immediately will try to say that no, it is something which is media is really fabricating it, right? There is a consensus. It's a selected picture of that. Like somebody with a certain interest is creating this concept. But you know that it is much more dangerous than that, because if you actually disclose this to somebody saying that, look, why are you saying X community is anti-national? Because there are many in the minority committee are patriotic. They have dedicated their life for the country. There are many in the majority country who are actually being spies and betrayers of this country, right? This should count as an evidence against calling a minority community as anti-national. But do you know what the response of the other person? He will say, yeah, I really accept that, there are people in the minority community who are, patriotic. Majority of the minority community are patriotic. I know that there are a lot of majority community people who are actually non-patriotic. But do you know, some people are anti-national because they belong to this minority community, right? So you cannot now break this, right? Because the other person has actually imbibed all your critical resources into, he accepts all your critical thinking methods, still hold on to this stereotype, right? This is where you need a critical philosophical help to break that, hold of that stereotype, right? No more arguing. You need to have a certain kind of politics. You need to engage with a certain social reality in order to break that idea. Right? So it is in that sense that one senses of politically emancipatory critical thinking, right, which is in unmasking stereotype, right, where actually in stereotype, it's like stereophonic recorder. A certain conceptual ability is reified and it very intensely discloses some selective aspect of our social life. Right? So engaging with that is it demands a very, very great operation. In fact, I think somebody should today write a critique of stereotypical reason, right? A reason which sees stereotypes in it. It's not merely illusion or some partial thinking which create stereotype.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Dr. E.M. Prasanna. Shall we say Kant's notion of reason is something universal? Cognitive science is based on the idea that reason is embodied. They argue that most of our reasoning is unconscious. How do you critically approach this?
Yeah, that question takes us to, the heart of the Kantian thinking and also the difficulties with Kantian thinking, right? The Kantian subject is what we call a transcendental subject. It's a transcendental unity of apperception, to use the jargon in Kant, right? So transcendental means that it is not empirical, but in some sense it is about the experiential world, right? That is what it is. It's not something isolated from this. It actually gives the structure for our world-directedness, world-bound nature of our, consciousness. But, people have criticized it by saying that, look, it is, the Kantian idea is a very formal idea, right? It's just the I thing which accompanies all my representation, right? Every expression, when I see something, right, there is an I thing which accompanies all my, experiences, right? And that is what allows it to be unified into one source of knowledge, etc., presented in front of me, etc. Right? Now, the criticism was that this transcendental subject is a disembodied, formal, empty subject, and today you need, in order to get an understanding of actual cognition, we need to think about ours. We are embodied beings, right? And this is a criticism which later phenomenologists will bring to Kant and cognitive psychologists, right? It's because I have a body, right? I am not a totally bodiless person who comes and looks at the world. And if I do like this, I can't understand how do I get the knowledge about the world. As I told you, when I look at a coffee cup, right? I only see one part of the coffee cup, but the coffee cup is an entity with that handle is inviting me to come and go and take that coffee cup in my hand, turn it in around, right? Coffee cups are there only in a world of coffee drinkers, right? As a coffee drinker, I am familiar with it. It's not that I have my first encounter with this strange entity called coffee cup. You shouldn't think about human cognition, right? So in fact, my ability to point out that coffee cup, that is not the way to model cognition, right? My ability to go pick up the coffee cup, turn it around, sip the coffee, that is my engagement with it. That's what the idea about embodiment, right? I need to have a body. My body has to be brought into the world. I need to be able to coordinate this world around me, not in front of me as a passive observer. Right? So this correction has been brought about in the history of philosophy. But then, critique will always come and say, look, the Kantian idea about the transcendental subject is already a finite subject, right? It is actually saying that it is a finite subject which is open to sensations, right? So we cannot know without sensations. But there may be entities which have intellectual intuitions that they can actually know the reality without really dabbling with reality. But we human beings are not like that. That our knowledge is totally predicated on what the senses speak to us. In that sense, one might say Kant already accepted we are embodied being. But, these are all academic debates, but this field is so enriched by cognitive scientists and phenomenologists trying to bring the question about body and also try to bring the question about unconscious, right? This whole idea that there is a certain way in which I am immediate to myself, right? Now, in some sense, Kant himself is a critique of that. There is no immediacy like Cartesian subject. See, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, right? So in Kant, that connection of therefore cannot be made. That I am is an object of knowledge. It's only by distancing myself, right? Breaking off myself from this thinking I that I can even come to know about myself. So there is a kind of constitutive gap between the I think and the I am, the embodied meaning. And the whole I think cannot work without constantly stitching itself to this I am. Right? And for Kant, time is the kind of thread which this constant, this stitching is happening within my internal life so that I can be, I have occasional perceptions, but I have this continuous cognitive life. But it has these gaps and holes and stitchings into it. But the idea about unconscious brings it extremely a radical challenge to the Kantian critique, and that is where Freud, the three masters of Paul Ricoeur will say three critical masters of suspicion: Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. Right? Each one of them will bring something to Kant and say that, look, this idea about reason. The idea of Kantian critique, I said that reason is legislating, is setting up a tribunal in order to interrogate its own powers. But reason is not capable of doing it, right? If you look at the question about body, if you look at the question about the unconscious, then this idea about reason interrogating itself, right? It's not a tenable task, right? So critique cannot send. It has to look at the other aspect. In Marx, it is the economic production, the class struggle, the real struggle in the political field. That is what sustained the operations of reason and subjectivity. So that way I agree. There is a great critical tradition. That's the tradition of critical theory. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Anuja Jose. How is Kant's transcendental deduction different from his transcendental logic?
Transcendental deduction, right? See, when Kant actually brings us the question about categories, right? There are deductions and expositions, right? There are transcendental deductions and metaphysical deductions. There, what in transcendental deduction, what happens is that from the nature of human reason, right? The way in which human reason gives into the cognitive faculty. How do we come up with the categories, right? Right, and that's where a challenge which Hegel gives is that, where did Kant get all these categories, right? Now, it seems to be a kind of psychological idea about the world, right? The I think is not reducible to psychological idea. It seems to be, the category seems to be culled out from the experience of a psychological individual who is studying. That is where you come up with all this quantity, quality, causality, etc. Now, it is not wrong. Kant is on the right track because he is actually letting up there are a priori structures, our own contribution, which we structures experience, right? But Kant is, where is Kant getting it from? And Hegel, when he actually, in Hegel's logic, Hegel is trying to say that, no, we can actually give an account of these categories, right? Their logical foundation without reference to this Kantian transcendental subject, which is, on the other hand, it is an empty subject, or it is formal, or it is very psychological, anthropological subject. So Kant's, Hegel's idea was to give logic an account of it from a standpoint which is more logically rigorous, which doesn't apparently is rooted in the achieved cognitive accomplishments of a psychological entity. Whereas transcendental logic, then, we are actually thinking about the foundations of logic, itself, right? That is how does the logic actually pertains to, something like when we do mathematics, when you reason about the world, how does our reason end up being pertaining to the world? That is what formal transcendental logic should come up. Now, the question can be asked is, the kind of logical notions which Kant has, right, about the relation between subject and predicate, about the nature of non-law of contradictions, the law of excluded middle, etc. It is still driven by the normal, formal, traditional logic. But Kant is, in transcendental logic, Kant is claiming that no, the logic can have a foundation which is not merely in its methodological principle of anything, but we can give it a worldly foundation to logic, which is again not a consequence of which is not gathering from our experience. So this is a kind of preliminary take on that extremely serious question about transcendental deduction and logic. Shall we go to the next question?
Thank you, sir. So the next question is, so can you please tell us how Kant's notion of critical philosophy influenced English romantic poetry? The question is from Rit.
That I'm not capable of answering that question at all, right? That I think somebody from who studies the history of literature should be. I'm really sorry that I will not be able to tell you how Kant's real, I don't want to make some guesses based on Kant's relation to romanticism as such, right? The philosophy of the Hegelian, right? The move from the critical philosophy to speculative philosophy, and the valorization of the subject and the subject's access to absolute knowledge. How does this, form the basis of romanticism, right? Can be said, but the question is about actually how does it, and my knowledge about poetry as it is, and even poetry, English poetry is so minimal that I don't want to risk answering that question. I hope somebody in the, I would actually welcome if somebody in the listeners would like to tell that. Otherwise, I'm sure somebody who is competent in English literature should be able to answer.
Thank you,
Sorry,
sir.
disappointing response.
Sir, is there a formally structured universal law without vested interests so that we think in line with Kant?
The question is not clear. Universally structured law,
Sir, may I repeat the question?
or it is a moral law?
Sir, may I repeat the question?
Yes.
Is there a formally structured universal law without vested interests so that we think in line with Kant?
See, first of all, the idea is the law is, you call something law when it has a universal claim, right? So there are two kinds of law. One is Newton's law, right? Other is the moral law. And so the critique effort is to give us a distinction between, these law, right? And Hume made a big challenge to the question about the natural law, which connects cause and effect, right? And the Kantian criticism, the Humean criticism was that what you actually notice is that one ball hitting another ball, and then if a ball A hits B, the B will move, right? And but you cannot combine with any law which connects. All that you have said is finite experience. The event B is accompanied by event A. So we can only say they have a constant conjunction about them. Right? We cannot say that there is anything called law, something which necessarily bring about. So water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. Sometimes 10 times I observed, I saw it, but I cannot give a causal account of it, right? Whatever it is only some uniformity, right? And there is nothing like causal power, anything behind this. Now, Kant's attempt was to to make sense of the idea about a scientific law, fully accepting this criticism, skeptical criticism of, Hume, right? And Kant was saying, okay, in order to tell this world that there is no uniformity, you will have to have a story, right? You have to say that, okay, there are objects in the world which are unified, then there is a before and there is an after, right? Then there is a left and there is a right, right? So you bring in all these things and then you think that, okay, all this, you want to tell the story that there is no uniformity, right? Everything is just constant conjunction. You actually portray a scene of representation where this whole thing is presented to somebody who is observing it, right? And said, okay, this is all that I need, right? The necessity actually pertains to this situation of representation. That is where the necessity is. Now, the idea about whether the scientist has some peculiar interest, etc., right, are not pertinent to understanding where the force of the natural law comes about. Now, there is a lot of criticism about it. People would say that this is a very, very fragile notion about causality. All that you have is a certain relationship of a functional connection. You still haven't captured the sense of something bringing about something. But Kant says, no, if you understand necessity in this manner, we can make sense of a certain universality of nature, right? And which need not really say that, look, in this chaotic nature, there are some islands of stability, etc. No, right? We need to understand it purely in terms of this cognitive situation. The same way in the case of moral law, too, that, what he's trying to make sense of this idea about the sense of, something ruling as a moral law, that moral standpoint, right? And it is, you cannot make it into any fan. Then if it suits me, then I follow it, No, you cannot do that. If it suits everybody, then I do it. This cannot be a moral, you know, standpoint. In that sense, it is the moral subject is somebody who acts without a certain um, interests. Right now, it is not very effective to say that no, in actual life we all have interests. That Kant also will say. But what modernity allows you to is that it gives you a standpoint from which you can make an interest-free claim in the moral domain, right? And we can actually ignore the question about the unhappiness, the pain, which moral action, etc. But the real pertinent question is to say that, look, this peculiar moral law itself is rooted in an interest. Right? And this is the criticism people like Marx or Frankfurt School, people like Adorno, a great reader of Kant. He said, look, this is the bourgeoisie intellectual who is actually behind this moral subject. Right? This Kantian interest-free moral subject is actually a bourgeois individual. Right? Now, that criticism will be a pertinent criticism to take. Now, the further question then will be radicalizing it is locating interest, right? Actually saying is that, look, you should understand moral behavior by making still some reference to the moral subject, but morality is a far more dangerous game than you can understand it with respect to interest or interest-free interest as in Kant, right? It's not a domain where it is being played in the domain of interest at all. It is played in the domain of power, right? And that is the insight which some Nietzscheans brought into the issue.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, good.
There is a question from Professor Josie Joseph of our department.
Yes.
How do you respond to the charges of racism and even sexism against Kant? Clearly, there are passages that cannot be dismissed as historical prejudice, coming from someone who asked fundamental questions such as what is knowledge, what is man, morality, etc. So, how do you respond to the charges of racism and even sexism against Kant?
Yeah, that is again a very controversial topic, right? How do we make these charges against philosophers? Now, in the case of Kant, there is Kant's very famous treatise on anthropology, right? And which actually contains extremely racist comments, right? And some people will say that it is actually the pre-critical Kant, but after lot of research, including Foucault, translated that text and published it with an introduction, where we know that it is something which was alive throughout in Kant's intellectual journey. Right now, on the one hand, it is the Kantian philosophy which gives us some of the basic infrastructure to critique anything like racism, right? Now, the real challenge is to say that how is this critical tools themselves are implicated in racism, right? In fact, Kant, talks about, what he says, the primitive tribes, the Hollanders, right? His primitive types is in sometimes where he's seeing that, okay, even in them, like humanity can be seen, right? That is, he actually looks into them in order to see a certain humanity which is there even in such primitive tribes, where you can't claim any kind of sign of civility there, but even there is a glimpse of, humanity to come up. Right? And now that kind of a humanness which is invoked, right? That itself is implicated in the the racist violence, right? The idea that all races are all human beings, they are there, right? And that very idea about human being itself is implicated in the racist violence. And this is where we need to critically open up the the Kantian question, right? And the way Kant has interesting responses about the responses of India and China to the colonial life, and he actually notices that both the countries actually kept the colonial people away, right? And he like the Chinese actually look down upon them almost as evil, and Indians says keep them as entirely alien. And he actually sees in some virtue, in some glimpse of reason, right, when the colonialism reaches, because he was critical about the idea that you can actually bring enlightenment like that to other cultures. And he actually finds the glimpse of a critical reason in the Indian and Chinese refusal to the colonial effect to renew ourselves. But on the other hand, the human nature which is invoked by Kant itself might be implicated in the uh, racist violence which we try to critique. Now, this is the question about sexism also has brought about. On the one hand, the Kantian idea gives us a standpoint where we can raise above the all the critical tools which we actually use about gender justice, right? Now then, people like Kohlberg, when they actually looked at and say that the expectations of the Kantian standpoint, right, it is actually if you reconstruct a kind of developmental teleology of a person growing up, right, there are cognitive psychological work says, look, you can think about the Kantian disinterested standpoint as something which is the pinnacle of a uh, developmental journey of our moral learning. But the feminists have criticized and said no, right? The actually there are elements of caring, right, which are cannot be understood within the moral standpoint as anything which is respectable, right? Where the gender-free Kantian subject itself is implicated in a certain kind of insensitivity, right? To which something like care ethics should open up. Uh, so that sense, it is we have to really difficult where do we open up our criticism. Definitely, it cannot be the case that here is the Western, you know, male thinker, right? And so his thing has to be prejudiced towards the West and to the against women. That's not the standpoint, but as we can stand. But that doesn't exonerate the thinker from the entire critical tradition, which has tried to locate the sources of racial and sexist issues in uh, Kant himself.